Corder, and I teach in the history department. And for me and my colleagues in the department, we are just so grateful that you've all come. Thank you for coming on this cold night. I know you'd all rather be in DeKalb. Some of you would rather be in DeKalb tonight to watch the basketball team, but you're here. We have a terrific speaker. I want to say thank you to the Public Affairs Committee for funding this event, and thank you to the theater department for giving us their building, because they're actually in rehearsal for something, right? So this was a sacrifice on the part of our colleagues in theater. Dr. Stephen Barry earned his PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Today he is an associate professor of history at the University of Georgia, and he is the Gregory Chair of Civil War History as well. At Georgia, he co-directs their Center for Virtual History and a whole host of other things that I will not read. Dr. Barry is the author of 2 books, All That Takes a Man, Love and Ambition in the Civil War South, which was published by Oxford, and House of Abraham, Lincoln and the Todds, A Family Divided by War, which is a fabulous book, and the book on which this talk is based. He's written several articles, has a long list of conference presentations, has edited 2 books, one called Weirding the War, Stories from the Civil War's Ragged Edges, and Princes of Cotton, 4 Diaries of Young Men in the South, 1848 to 1860, and now he's working on a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. As you can tell from this list, he's interested in Civil War history, in cultural and intellectual history, in gender and sexuality, and history of storytelling. Dr. Barry has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. His honors include the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer Award and an Excellence in Teaching Award at the University of Georgia. But I think there's a better way to learn about our lecturer, and that would be in his own words. So I quote from Dr. Barry. From an early age, there was something about the past that tugged at me. Thinking on the dead was like lying in the grass and staring at the stars. In pondering on all the people who had gone before, I felt humbled by, and yet connected to, the great and ever-unfolding drama of human being. These dead, I decided, had done one important thing I hadn't. They died. And so strangely, they could teach me how to live, tell me what mistakes not to make, what promises to live up to, what prejudices to live down. Their very pastness reminded me that the world they built was bequeathed to us, and we hold it in trust. Soon enough, we'll be gone too, and we must do all we can to pass on a better world to those who go on without us. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Barry.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I've had such a great time here in Monmouth already. Everyone that I met in the history department has been so nice. But I have to single out Dr. Cordery for her hospitality. She has been amazing in putting together not only a talk here for me, but a talk at Western Illinois and another talk at Knox. If she wasn't such a darn fine writer herself with her own career, I think she could be my agent for everything in the world. But of course, she's an amazing biographer in her own right and on her own book tour, and had to fly back here to be here for this talk. So I really, really do appreciate all the work she did to get me here. And I'm excited to talk about House of Abraham. A few years back, I wrote this book, now out in paperback, that argues that you just can't understand Lincoln or Mary Lincoln, for that matter, if you don't understand what was happening with their larger family, particularly Lincoln's in-laws, the Todds. Now, I've met some resistance, quite frankly, to this argument, and I think most of that resistance is because presidential relatives fall into certain pre-existing stereotypes. Of course, this is the president's half-brother, Roger Clinton. He was jailed for selling cocaine. He had multiple DUIs. Here's the Reagan family, of course, as they wanted to be seen. Ron pursued ballet, which is fine, but it didn't quite fit with Reagan's image as a cold warrior. I don't know if anyone will remember on Saturday Night Live, he performed a Tom Cruise underwear dance. That might have been a little slightly embarrassing. Patty wrote a tell-all autobiography claiming her father was cold, her mother was abusive. She posed for Playboy. Perhaps most inexcusably, this is the trifecta of bad TV. She appeared on The Love Boat, Chips, and Fantasy Island. And as much as it pains me to do this as a son of Georgia, no survey of the black sheep of American first families would be complete without this guy. Poor Billy Carter seemed on a mission to embarrass himself. He hawked redneck power pickup trucks, Madoff color comments, and slugged, by his own estimate, 20 to 30 cans of beer a day, which I suspect may have had something to do with his being caught once on film, publicly urinating. So, to the extent that historians ever focused on the Todds, they put them naturally into this model of the dysfunctional families of the men who have inhabited the White House. And they can be seen, to a degree, in that mold. But I'm going to try to make the case tonight that I make in the book that the political and personal stakes for Lincoln were a lot higher with respect to the Todds. Lincoln described himself once, in family terms, as a bit of driftwood. He was almost alone in the world. His mother had died early. His brother had died early. His sister had died early. His father saw him as sort of a disappointing source of manual labor. So he didn't know much about what it meant to be in a family, especially a nuclear family. But after his marriage to Mary Todd, he was suddenly awash in an ocean of family hubbub. What he knew about extended family, its sorrows and its triumphs, the way it fights and falls apart, all of that he learned from the Todds. So what I'm going to suggest is, yes, absolutely, the Todds did scandalize the Lincoln administration in some ways that we'll explore tonight, but they were also integral to his experience and ultimately his interpretation of the Civil War. So here they are, the Todd family. Mercifully, not all 14 of these children were born to the same mother. The first 6 children on the top there, Elizabeth, Francis, Levi, Mary, Ann, and George, were all born to Eliza Parker. Immediately after George is born, Eliza becomes ill with what we suspect is childbed fever. Within days, she has passed on. We don't know the source of the infection exactly, but this was an age when doctors didn't even bother to sterilize themselves or their hands even after autopsies. When a young medical student published a paper that said, you know, maybe we ought to wash our hands, it was met. One of his elders said, "Sir, I am a gentleman, and a gentleman's hands are clean." So that's the likely source, and she quit the world shortly after George was born. Within weeks, their father, Robert, was courting a new wife, Betsy Humphreys, and together they had 8 children before she slips mercifully into menopause. Now, some have tried to claim that this makes the Todds 2 families. There's one family that's born to the first wife, there's another family that's born to the second. This is an error, I believe. This is an unfortunately common familial pattern for people living in an age when many women went out of the world on the birthing couch. Then, too, if you look at the way they describe each other in their letters, in their conversations, how they were understood by neighbors and the public, nobody uses stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister. They understood themselves. They were understood by everyone else as being one family. I think then we must pay them the courtesy to understand them in the same terms as one family. Okay, like many Kentucky families, as you might guess, they were thrown into domestic pandemonium by the Civil War. Kentucky fought the Brothers' War more completely than any other. 3/5 of the white soldiers from Kentucky fought on the Union side, 2/5 fought on the Confederate side. That's a ratio that's closer to half than you see in any other state. And as the war continued, Kentucky, of course, slipped into a guerrilla warfare all its own, neighbors pitted against neighbor. As one noted, secession has divided states and counties and produced discord among neighbors, old friends, and even families. A gloom is over this once happy land, the future all dark, and the whole fabric of our government tottering to the fall. Another witness simply noted, the division of house against house, foretold by our Lord, was never more complete and utter. And one of those strange ironies, Kentucky's state motto, which you may know, was adopted in 1792. It was, united we stand, divided we fall. So what had been this pledge of unity for these people in 1792 becomes a predictor of disaster, and divided they fell. Okay, what about for the Todds? Well, like Kentucky, they're broken almost exactly in half. 6 of the siblings sided with the Union, 8 with the Confederacy. you might be wondering, and certainly I was, when I tripped on them, how is it earthly possible that nobody had written this book before me? There are clever people out there. You've got the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, you've got divided families. Surely this is publishing gold, I thought to myself, and my agent thought so too. Why hadn't it been done before? Well, I figured that out after the book had already been signed. 2 reasons. The records first were thin and scattered across the country, and I was driving, with ramen fried noodles and a case of those in the back of my car all the way through Kentucky. So that was one reason. But the other is that the Todds weren't always very likable. They were litigious. Many of them drank too much. Some of them could be cruel. Sometimes, honestly, studying the antics of these people, I decided that if they were born again, they'd be the sort of family that would be on Jerry Springer, throwing chairs at each other. It's that kind of family. The thing is that tragedy sometimes befalls families who partly deserve it. Sam was shot through the gut and died at the second day of Shiloh. Alec was killed in a friendly fire incident outside Baton Rouge. 2 Todd sisters lost their husbands, including Mary, as a result of the war. If you fast forward to just after the war, you can add 3 girls who died in childbirth in their early to mid-30s. And finally, 2 boys who died in their 30s and 40s of what I'll just call rough living. We can talk about that later. So really what you have here is a pretty sad family. It's a train wreck, really. This is a family that suffered for its sins. They were, in a sense, the nation writ small, I decided, suffering the partly deserved, totally self-inflicted misery of the Civil War and its aftermath. Now, I couldn't possibly give you, and you wouldn't want, a history of all 14 of these Todds. That was one of the challenges of the book. You've got so many characters. Instead, I'm just going to focus on 2. One who had a negative impact on the Lincolns, and one who had a positive impact. This is David Todd. He was born in 1832. Even as a kid, he was difficult to control. At 14, he ran off to fight in the Mexican War. His father kind of hoped that this would give him some army discipline. I don't think his father quite knew the army that he sent to Mexico and what it would teach you. David at 14 really learned to gamble and to drink and to smoke and to sin in worse ways. So after the war was over, he didn't want to come back to Kentucky, so he joined the California gold rush. He told his family that he was prospecting and even sent a nugget of gold back, but he's really not making any money. In 1850, I find him in the census as a Yolo County farmhand. When gold loses its rush, he ships out as a freebooter. That is, he's a soldier for hire, essentially. His exact movements are unclear. I can find him again in 1851 in Chile. He's fighting in what historians now call the First Succession Revolution. David bore the stamp of this experience forever, a Chilean national flag tattooed in full color on his left arm. And this wasn't his only tattoo. Over the years, he accumulated an anchor on his right arm, crossed guns, and a shot and game pouch on his right breast, and a heart pierced with an arrow on his left breast. As I say in the book, by 25, David was a highly decorated soldier in America's rogue army. This is what passes for humor among historians. Now, like most rogues, David had to settle down. At some point, he settles in New Orleans. It makes sense. It's a sinning city. It's a bustling city. It's a place that's easy to get into, easy to get out of. I'm not sure quite what he was doing, but in 1857, I find him again, working at W.W. Crane and Company. It's a carriage repository on Carondelet Street. I found some advertisements for W.W. Crane carrying a complete assortment of carriages from the best manufactories. Crane advertised itself as a home of guaranteed low prices and encouraged purchasers with cash and approved paper to come on down and examine our stock before making selections elsewhere. So in other words, he's working at a car dealership, essentially, from 1857 to 1861. So when war breaks out, he's basically a belligerent, drunk, overweight car dealer. But he did have military experience right from the Mexican War. He did talk tough. He did have friends in Richmond, so he was sure to find a position. It was shocking to me that he happened to find this one. David is appointed to be the commandant of Richmond's new jail system, in July of 1861, just in time to receive the 1,421 prisoners who were taken at Bull Run. This is a job that is going to require enormous tact, something that is not David's long suit. The captured Yankees created a citywide sensation. Guests raced to the windows of their hotels to get a peep at them as they were forced marched through the streets. Gauntlets thronged their path to the jail, cursing, ridiculing, and spitting upon them. The jail became the picture gallery of the town, as crowds of idlers, churchgoers, and society women drawn in slow-moving carriages all strained to catch a glimpse of this newly foreign thing, a Yankee. The square was for weeks packed with rebels, recalled an inmate. Whenever they caught sight of a federal officer, they pointed at him, insulted at him. Men, women, and even little children scarcely old enough to walk. The frenzy was fully supported by the local papers. Yankees were compared to zoo animals, lunatics, or worse. Behold how they multiply, noted the Richmond Whig of the Yankee. They multiply like the Chinese, the aphids, and all the other pests of the animal kingdom. Pull the bark from a decayed log and you will see a mass of maggots, full of vitality, in constant motion and eternal gyration, crawling over one another, creeping under one another, all precisely alike, all intently engaged in preying upon one another. And you have an apt illustration of Yankee numbers, Yankee equality, and Yankee prowess. Another reporter pointed out the obvious absurdity. One would think live Yankees must have undergone some wonderful transformation of late. Do the ladies and children who are so eager to get a peep expect to see them sporting horns and hoofs? Yankees have been common enough among us before now, haven't they? But a wonderful transformation had occurred. Brothers were now enemies, Northerners were now infidels, invaders, and pests. And David seems to not only have fully imbibed this spirit of demonizing Yankees, but he wanted to practice it on their bodies. One of his subordinates, I'll note, is a guy whose name we might know, Henry Wirz. Henry Wirz will go on to be hung for war crimes for what happened at Andersonville. Well, according to prisoners, Todd took personal delight in human blood and suffering, and Wirz was his ever-willing pupil. I think Wirz thought that cruelty pleased Todd, remembered one inmate, so he tried to imitate him. There was something in Todd's voice and manner, recalled another, that always indicated a desire to commit some cruel wrong. And over the next month, David would make himself, I think, a deserving scapegoat for all the problems in this particular system. Okay, 3 charges are laid at David's door in the early months of the war when he's commandant of the Richmond prison system. The first is that men were essentially summarily executed during his tenure. How this happened? Basically, it's called Libby Prison in this picture. In 1861, they're just hastily converted tobacco warehouses. They don't even have a name. All they bother to do is put bars on the lower windows so people can't get out, and there are no bars on the upper windows. It is July 1861. These are Union men who haven't been seasoned, so they are all disease-ridden. They are all stuck in a tobacco warehouse, unventilated, hotter than hell, as you might imagine. Well, they're trying to hang out the window. They're trying to get some kind of fresh air. And what David tells his guardsmen is, if they stick their arm out, shoot that off. If they stick their head out, shoot that off too. And we have the names of at least 3 men, New Yorkers, who were killed as a result of this practice. So that's number 1 charge, the summary execution of prisoners. The second is that he allowed an epidemic to rage inside his jail. As I said, the sanitary conditions in there are miserable. He has an order that you can only go to the latrine during the day and buy 2s with an escort. What that means is there are long lines of people queued up, all of them with dysentery and worse, who need to get to a latrine at some time. Well, they don't make it, so they create sinks inside the jails. Well, now you poison the water supply, now you've ensured that everyone has dysentery. So this massive epidemic runs through the jails. David doesn't care. He says, well, bury them in the Negro graveyards among their friends. They get what they deserve. So they start dying in frightful numbers. He hated the smell of dead Yankees, so he ordered them all to be buried. But this relates to the 3rd charge, desecrating the dead, which is a pretty serious one, the kicking of corpses. What basically happens is he's cleaned his jails after the epidemic of all the dead Yankees, and another one dies. And his guardsmen are not sure what they should do with this one, so they carry him down to headquarters, and they can't knock on the door and carry the body, so they just put it down on the porch. David comes out, he can't believe here's another Yankee stiff, and he kicks it out into the street and says, leave it there. And this is just finally too much. The public in Richmond, one thing they don't want to feel is pity for these people. And there is something pitiful in this scene. Just one dead Yankee, cold and getting colder overnight. So finally, General Winder figures out that David is such a liability that he's going to have to be replaced and even dressed down. And on August 9th, David is arrested. By August 18th, he's been relieved of command. Ironically, that doesn't hurt David's career at all. He actually goes on to serve rather well at Vicksburg. What no one has seen, though, is the impact of this on Mary and her reputation inside Washington, D.C. Now, to understand how this happens, we have to look at the timing on the scandal at the Richmond prison system. It doesn't really break until early 1862. These soldiers are taken in July 1861, but they're held through the winter and only released in January to tell their story to the press. Well, by then, Mary has scandals of her own making that are breaking in the press as well, and it creates this perfect storm of controversy. So I just want to walk quickly through the couple of scandals unrelated to her brother that are breaking in February 1862. Mary, as we now understand, is probably bipolar and something of a shopaholic. So what she tended to do is when she's depressed, she'll buy things just because they're pretty and they make her feel better and they make her feel pampered. And when she's in her manic phase, then she just splurges. And we have examples of this. Each First Lady was given $20,000 for the 4-year term that they're supposed to use gradually to refurbish the White House. She blows through that money in a month in an orgy of purchasing and maybe more with Commissioner of Public Buildings William S. Wood. I say maybe more because Lincoln got an anonymous letter warning him, if Wood continues as commissioner, he will stab you in your most vital part. Gentlemen, I think you know where that is. Mary accepted bribes to help people get jobs in her husband's administration. People gave her diamonds to be a port collector. She was given $20,000 to help lobby for somebody else. Now, in that day and age, that's not that crooked. That's the way politics is conducted. But by comparison to Lincoln, whom Mary called a monomaniac on the subject of honesty, it's a sharp distinction. Now she would say, right, well honey, you can afford to take the high road because I'm taking the low, which is where a lot of politics is being conducted. But I think she's sunk too low sometimes. I'll give you a quick example. With the White House gardener, John Watt, to school her in the fine art of cooking the books, she overcharged the Interior Department for state dinners, sold off White House furniture, took kickbacks from merchants, drew money on flowers not delivered and labor not performed, and had Mrs. Watt appointed to a sinecure, though then Mary collected the salary herself. So this is number one, a scandal of her own making, breaking in February 1862, that she is maybe indiscreet, and especially so with money. Now the second scandal is more serious, involving a charge that's closer to treason. Mary's inner circle had quite a few shady characters in it, two of them depicted here. I call them the Blue Roomers because they would always meet in the Blue Room of the White House and discuss things in French. Some of the men who hung around her, one is Daniel Cap Sickles. They all had their little nicknames for each other, so she was La Reine. She's the queen of the Blue Room. Daniel Sickles was known as Cap. Anyway, Sickles was, according to a witness, one of the bigger bubbles in the scum of the legal profession, swollen and windy and puffed out with fetid gas, which sounds painful. Sickles is infamous for having his corps way out of position on the second day at Gettysburg. a gaffe that cost him a leg. But he's also notorious for taking a prostitute to Queen Victoria's court and presenting her to the Queen. Of course, he's infamous more so. In 1859, he guns down his wife's lover on a Washington thoroughfare in broad daylight in front of witnesses. The victim was Philip Barton Key, the nephew of the Chief Justice of the United States and the son of Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner. Nevertheless, of course, Sickles gets off with the first ever use of the temporary insanity defense. Now, this is impossible, but even with a murder on his rap sheet, Sickles was not the biggest rogue to penetrate Mary's salon. That honor belongs to this man, the Chevalier Henry Wyckoff. Wyckoff had kidnapped a tobacco heiress in Italy and spent some time in prison for it. His account of the scrape, My Courtship and Its Consequences, was reviewed as one of the least creditable volumes ever produced by an American. It was a great review. No less an authority than P.T. Barnum credited Wyckoff with teaching him his first ever lesson in the art of hokum. Wyckoff was, noted Washington officials variously, a terrible libertine, a world-renowned whoremonger and swindler, an unclean bird, a vile creature, a social pariah, a man with a singular facility for thrusting his diplomatic fingers into other people's pies. It is a disgrace to American society, wrote Lincoln's secretary, that it suffered such a thing to be at large. And among his other shifts, Wyckoff was a spy for the New York World. In early 1862, he somehow gets a copy of Lincoln's annual message to Congress, and he leaks it to the press. Now, if there's one thing any president in the world does not like, it is to read a speech that he hasn't given yet over his morning coffee. That's going to be a humiliating moment before Congress, pronouncing something that they've already read over their coffee. So Congress calls for an investigation. Wyckoff is subpoenaed, deposed. He admits that, well, the information may have passed through me, but won't give any more information, so they slap him in the Capitol prison. Well, now the Blue Roomers have to scramble. Cap Sickles is a lawyer. He shuttles between the White House and the Capitol prison and concocts one of the wildest stories, I think, ever told to Congress. Basically, it goes like this. John Watt, White House gardener, so he would have access to the executive mansion, apparently has a remarkably retentive memory. Because what he claims is he's perambulating about the White House and he happens to notice a parchment on the president's desk. Glancing it over once, he remembers it perfectly. Then, in a casual conversation with Wyckoff later in the morning, he repeats the entire thing, and Wyckoff, an equal miracle when it comes to memory, he retains it perfectly also, and then later has a conversation with someone at New York World. Ridiculous. A ridiculous story. Everyone knew it was ridiculous. By the time they concoct it, everybody's already figured it out. There's only one way this document could have gotten into Wyckoff's possession. It has to be Mary. Lincoln's figured it out too, and he goes to members of this investigating committee and says, maybe we should stop looking. So those are two things that are breaking already. And then news starts to break that the First Lady of the land has a brother who likes to kick dead Yankees. So the other indiscretions might have been forgiven, but now we've got a perfect storm of bad press for Mary. Rumors circulate that Watt is a rebel sympathizer, that Wyckoff was a foreign intriguer, probably was a foreign intriguer, possibly in league with the Confederacy. If Mary Lincoln is giving state documents to such men as these, isn't it possible that she is a rebel too? The charge is ridiculous, of course, but there were spies in Washington. Mary had behaved imprudently, at least, and she did have a brother who liked to kick dead Yankees. We have to imagine what it would be for us today if Michelle Obama had brothers in Al-Qaeda. If you don't think that that would resonate politically, you're crazy. So how we managed to forget that Mary Lincoln had brothers fighting and dying for the Confederacy, I have no idea. So the public may have disconnected the dots, but they didn't invent them. Not a few bitter tongues, remember to witness, began to roundly assert that Mrs. Lincoln herself was in constant correspondence as a spy with the chiefs of the rebellion. Through her, they obtained the secrets of the cabinet and plans of generals in the field. And from that moment to this, Mary has never been a popular First Lady. So that's an example, I think, of a negative impact on the Lincolns. I want to turn to a more positive story. This is Emily Todd. She was born in 1836. She was by common consensus the prettiest of the Todd girls. There's this story that survives that she was kidnapped off the streets in Lexington at the age of 3, and they caught the kidnappers and they hauled them in front of the judge, and their only excuse was, well, look at her. They couldn't evidently help themselves. She was so cute. Unlike David, Emily was very close with the Lincolns, even before the war. They first met. Lincoln, as you may know, was elected to Congress in 1846. In 1847, he visits Mary's family in Lexington. And Emily tells the story of the first time that she saw him. Lincoln walks in, he's got this huge black coat on, he's a big man anyway. I mean, he's 6'4", but for that day and age where an average man is 5'6", he's a giant. And then he has this huge woolly cap on as well. So the giant makes his introductions to everyone else, and she's hiding behind her mother's skirts because she doesn't know who this guy is. And Lincoln finally sort of peers around and sees her and just sweeps her up and says, ah, this is his little sister. And that's the name that he'll use for her for the rest of his life. Later, in 1855, Emily is invited to stay with the Lincolns in Springfield. 4 sisters by then are living in Springfield. The eldest sister has what I call a marital halfway house, right? She's established herself, and then she invites a sister, the sister gets married, and then she invites another and another. So she's grooming Emily to come live with her in Springfield, essentially. That doesn't work out. Emily returns to Kentucky, where she marries Benjamin Houghton Helm, and he too becomes quite close to Lincoln. They were both born in the same place around Knob Creek, Kentucky. They're both really Kentucky moderates in a lot of ways. They both all know the same people, so they are all quite close. When Lincoln is elected president, Mary hoped that Emily would come to be an ornament in her White House court. And Abraham Lincoln offered Houghton Helm a job with the Union Paymaster Corps with the rank of major. We don't realize that that's the highest offer that he can make without the approval of Congress. And what he's essentially trying to do is give Houghton Helm an alternate version of his life. Come, send Mary here. If you can't be here and fight against your sister states of the South, I'll send you to Mexico. I'll send you wherever you need to go. But please, please, don't be on the other side of me. Houghton considers the offer carefully. He talks it over with friends, including Robert E. Lee. I had a bitter struggle with myself, he admitted to a friend. The most painful moment of my life was when I declined the generous offer of my brother-in-law. Houghton Helm rises to the level of brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He's killed in September 1863 while trying to rally a 3rd charge at the Union Center at the Battle of Chickamauga. When Lincoln first hears of Houghton's death, he says, I feel as David of old when told of the death of Absalom. I could not believe that no historian had ever followed up on this particular reference. Lincoln was a person who knew certain books perfectly well. He would have known what he meant when he used this particular metaphor. This story of David refers to the 2nd book of Samuel, in which King David's kingdom has divided north from south. His favorite son has risen in rebellion. David wants the rebellion put down, but he wants this son, Absalom, to be spared. Of course, in one of those strange stories of the Bible, Absalom gets his hair caught in the low-lying branches of a tree and can only dangle helplessly as the opposing general plunges spears into his chest. The news goes back to the throne room and to David that the rebellion's been broken, but all he can say is, well, what about Absalom? What about Absalom? Finally, somebody tells him that he's dead, and the king cries, would to God I had died for thee, Absalom, my son, my son. And what's more interesting, maybe, is the aftermath of this story. Emily had been in Atlanta, where many of the Confederate dead are buried after Chickamauga. Now she needs to get back home to Union, Kentucky. She secures a pass from Lincoln to get back, but she's stopped at Fortress Monroe, a Union checkpoint on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. And there they ask her to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. She refuses. The man wearing that uniform had just killed her husband. She has 3 children, 1 a babe in arms. So now they don't know what to do. They've got a pass from their president, their commander-in-chief, that says let her through. They've also got an order that says she has to take the oath of allegiance. So they're conflicted, and they send a telegram to Lincoln, and Lincoln sends back 4 words. Send her to me. So you've got this crazy moment in the winter of 1863 when the widow of a slain Confederate general stays for a week in the White House. Lincoln is sticking his neck way out politically to do this for his little sister. If we are to believe Emily's diary, the sisters, though, were a real comfort to each other. Mr. Lincoln and my sister met me with the warmest affection, Emily confided in her journal. We were all too grief-stricken for speech. We could only embrace each other in silence and tears. Over the next week, the sisters gave each other what comfort they could, circling around the subjects that pained them most. We talk of old friends, Emily confessed. We talk of immaterial things. We cannot open our hearts to each other as freely as we would like. This frightful war comes between us like a barrier of granite, closing our lips but not our hearts. For though our tongues are tied, we weep over our dead together and express through our clasped hands the sympathy we feel for each other in our mutual grief. And I don't think it's a coincidence, exactly this moment, December 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, giving the president the right to pardon. And one of the first people he pardons is his little sister. So, what effect did all these Todds, the affections and the scandals, have on Abraham Lincoln generally and his experience and interpretation of the war particularly? First, I think it's important to remember that even without the Todds, Lincoln was accustomed to seeing this war in family terms. What, after all, did Lincoln really see of the war? He had very little exposure to the war the soldiers knew. This is a guy with virtually no military experience whatsoever. He fought in the Black Hawk War, where he admitted the mosquitoes were the biggest threat that he faced. As president, he paraded the soldiers, he reviewed their ranks and visited them in hospital, but he had no real idea what battle was like. But if the generals saw a war Lincoln didn't, Lincoln saw a war that generals didn't. He saw not the dead men, but their kin, the ones with the gaping holes in their lives, not their bodies. Widows and orphans, mothers, fathers, and sisters all sobbed their daily way to the White House and begged Lincoln to minister to their miseries, and minister he did. Some of my generals complain that I impair discipline by my frequent pardons and reprieves, Lincoln admitted upon commuting one deserter's death sentence, but it rests me, after a hard day's work, that I can find some excuse for saving some poor fellow's life, that I shall go to bed happy tonight, as I think how joyous the signing of this name will make himself, his family, and friends. Now, Lincoln's commutations are legendary, but I find dozens of examples where we find the President of the United States handling really small matters for his people because he feels their pain, because they're outside his office every day in a long line. I found a case where a sister said, "We need to get orthopedic boots to my brother, or he will be a permanent cripple." And the President of the United States makes sure that this one man has the right pair of shoes. This is a president who definitely felt his people's pain. Lincoln did merciful things as stealthily as others committed crimes, Roger G. Ingersoll remembered. So I grant that Lincoln may have been a long way from the physical horrors of the battlefield, but the emotional toll of the war literally came home to him every day. As a result, he saw a war the generals did, a war that was not a sequence of battles, but a vast mosaic of family crises. If the war is literally a family affair for Lincoln, I'd say it's also one figuratively. Even before the war, he couched his politics in familial language. With most men of the area, he had routinely referred to founding fathers, sister states. Slaveholders are our southern brethren. The discord over slavery threatened our national feelings of brotherhood. Having grown accustomed to those metaphors, he used them all the time during the Civil War. The United States is the home of one national family, he told Congress in 1862. We are all of the same family, the same sort, he said of Northerners and Southerners in 1863. This rebellion is an unhappy, fraternal war. Here is where I think Lincoln's affection for the familial metaphor is most evident. If you think about the war, it's a legal crisis, a constitutional crisis. It's a military matter. So what should the guy be reading? He should be reading the Founding Fathers. He should be reading legal texts. He should be reading Rousseau. He should be reading maps and military manuals. But what does everyone remember him reading? If you tarried beside the man for 2 seconds too long, you were going to hear some Shakespeare. He had 3 favorites. Richard III, Hamlet, and as he put it, above all, Macbeth. All three are tragedies. Richard III is classed as a history that fits the tragic mold. All three are set in grieving, war-torn countries. Hamlet's Denmark is contracted in one brow of woe. Richard's England hath long been mad and scarred herself. Macbeth's Scotland is a downfallen burthen where each new morn new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face. And in all three cases, right, the country's wounds are self-inflicted. A division in the ruling family has rent the kingdom and touched off a civil war. Now, why in the world would Lincoln, who lived such miseries, want to read about it? Because sometimes misery must be fed if it is to build and break. In his favorite plays, Lincoln crawled into a world where houses fall, families divide, and countries bleed. In language so beautiful, it has to be true. Shakespeare reflected back to Lincoln his own feelings and allowed him to feel the pain he already felt more intensely, and thus more cathartically. Let us seek out some desolate shade, the bard beckoned, and there weep our sad bosoms empty. So Lincoln was, I think, preconditioned to see the war through this lens of family drama. And that's why I think it genuinely broke his heart when in late 1864, Emily wrote him a bitter letter, severing their relations forever. She'd gotten back to Kentucky, another brother had died, the state was in turmoil, her mother was heartbroken, and in her exasperation, she laid all the blame at Lincoln's door. Her letter concludes, I would remind you that your mini bullets have made us what we are. If you think I give way to excess of feeling, I beg you will make some excuse for a woman almost crazed with misfortune. I often think about Lincoln getting this letter from his little sister. Your mini bullets have made us what we are. Were they his mini bullets? Had he caused the war? Did he feel guilty, responsible for so much death and destruction? So far as we knew, Lincoln never answered the letter. I think in a way he did. 2 months later, he delivered his second inaugural address. For 250 years, Lincoln said, this country has enriched itself and debased itself by enslaving, brutalizing, and raping other human beings. Northerners and Southerners have profited by slavery and acquiesced in slavery until finally God himself has come down to remove it. I tremble for my country, Jefferson had said, when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. By Lincoln's reckoning, God's justice had awoken, and he intended to mete it out Old Testament style. Fortune was to be repaid by misfortune. All debts were to be sunk in blood. Thus they were not Lincoln's mini bullets. Northerners had not killed Southerners or vice versa. God had killed them all, and for good reason. And the nation's attitude should be that of any other sinner whom God seeketh to chasten. It should submit, and then move humbly forward. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln is talking here about his own family. 2 Todd brothers had been killed in the war. 1 Todd sister had lost her husband. There were 2 widows and 6 orphans in the Todd family alone. He's also addressing, I think, a nation of Todds, united by blood and divided by bloodshed. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that there is a lesson here about ourselves as a national family. As Americans, we are not a family in the sense that we all love each other. Looking at the political rhetoric we have used for decades, we clearly don't. Rather, we're a family in the same way as the Todds. We implicate each other. We can't escape each other. We share a name, Americans, and we share a destiny. So whatever we are to face in the coming years, we need to start facing it together. There's a saying that goes, if you want to change the world, change the metaphor. We could do a lot worse than employ the metaphor Lincoln preferred. For as he understood, we are, like it or not, one family. We will rise or fall, sink or swim together. Thank you. We probably have a little time.
You got 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
But you're probably after you.
Okay, I will repeat the questions from the front and really anything about the Lincolns. It doesn't Yeah.
What was Abraham's relationship with Mary's mom and dad?
Not very good. Robert Lincoln had a favorite son-in-law already. That position was already taken. It was Ninian Edwards. Remember when I mentioned this first sister who started this marital habit? They were part of the Long Nine. So Ninian Edwards and Abraham Lincoln go to state Congress in Illinois together. And Ninian is just sure that he's 10 times the politician. He's the son of a governor. And he has tons of money. And he just cannot believe it, and then can't forgive it when Lincoln just goes on without it. But Robert Todd dies in roughly 49, so he never got to see what Lincoln became. So we'll never really know if he would have been proud. Other questions about?
Does Robert Todd Lincoln visit his Mary's family?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I want to tell the rest of Emily's story. So your mini bullets have made us what we are. And then Lincoln is killed, and she writes Robert, and she says, "Do you need me to come?" And I think that's what families are, right? They lash out at the only people who care about them. But then when times are tough, they close ranks. And the interesting thing about Robert and Emily is that they outlive their families so dramatically. So Emily had been married to Benjamin Hardin Helm for about 7 years when he's killed at Chickamauga. She is his widow for 70 years. She is his professional widow for 70 years. And similarly, Robert, his dad obviously is murdered in 1865. His mother is dead by 1884, and his 3 brothers die early as well. So he's sort of alone on the planet, and Emily's in that same bind. And so they're extraordinarily close. Emily travels to Hildene. They're kind of like the survivors who are living behind these great men. Robert behind Abraham Lincoln, and Emily behind Benjamin Hardin Helm. So they have this life together where they prop up these men in public, but then in private, they have each other. So it's just a really fascinating story. I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah?
With Mary Todd's obviously vast family with different interests, and as well as the question of how she acted as a first lady, was
Yeah.
there any public assumption or questioning of where her loyalties lie?
There was. I think that, what happens to her is really unfortunate. The best one-sentence biography that's ever been written about Mary was written by her older sister, and it was, she's had a lot to deal with, and she hasn't dealt with it very well. And I think that both things are right. If you think about Mary Lincoln, she had 3 reasons to get up in the morning: her husband, her boys, and her political advancement, in an age where women couldn't advance themselves, and she's got a political mind, and it's a sharp one. Those are the 3 reasons she gets up in the morning. Well, her husband is murdered while she's holding his hand. 3 of her sons die early, and the other one commits her to an insane asylum. And her advancement splits the nation, and her ties to the Confederacy ensure that she's the scapegoat of the Civil War, while her husband goes on to be deified. That's a lot to deal with. She didn't deal with it very well, I will say. Yeah? The Todd family owned slaves. All of them they have memories of, and fond memories of, their men. So they are what we call a very moderate Kentucky family, which is, we don't call them slaves, we call them servants, we don't buy them, we don't sell them, but we have them. Now what happens to Kentucky, as you probably know, is that it becomes more and more like a slave state, in the sense that in Lexington itself, you have one of the most notorious slave jails. So they don't beat their own slaves, they have them sent to the jail to be beaten by a professional. This guy that owns that slave jail raids across the river to grab free blacks, essentially from Ohio, breaks the men down in the dungeon, and sends the light-skinned slaves upstairs where you can buy them for a night or a lifetime. So what's going on in Lexington is chilling, but there's this game of civilized pretend that's being played at houses like the Todds. But you you know it had an impact on them and their thinking about slavery. Other questions? Yeah.
As Mary was committed to the same asylum, was Emily and Robert stay close friends again during that time period, or did they stay away?
Right. Yeah, so the question is, what are the circumstances under which Mary is sent to an insane asylum, and then does the family close ranks, particularly Emily and Robert? Robert is, of course, the son who's left to commit his mother. Now, basically what happens to Mary is that she feels safe nowhere after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I've written on this a little bit, and when you think there are 4 people in that box, Abraham Lincoln is murdered. Mary we'll talk about in a second. The other 2 in that box, Clara Harris, the daughter of a senator, and her fiancé, Henry Rathbone. Look at the end they made. So all of the blood in the box is not Lincoln's. It's actually Rathbone's. Rathbone is the only guy to actually grapple with, get his hands on Booth. Booth thinks that he's there to shoot Abraham Lincoln and then stab Ulysses S. Grant, who's supposed to be there also. Rathbone is a major. He gets his hands on Booth. Booth carves him basically from the elbow all the way to the armpit. Rathbone's bleeding everywhere, on everybody. Mary is screaming, "My husband's blood, my husband's blood." Well, it's all Rathbone's, essentially. He almost bleeds out. He's gone almost ghostly white, and he's only thinking about the president. The president's been shot, the president's been shot. That's all he can say. Well, he becomes so focused on this moment where he didn't perform as a man, where he didn't stop this assassination, that he begins to go crazy. And in 1883, he slips behind his wife, holds a gun to the back of her head, pulls a trigger, and then starts stabbing himself. And he claims to the end of his life in the insane asylum that he was grappling with her assassin, which he was, because it's him. I tell this story because I want you to see that everybody in that box is enormously damaged. Lincoln is dead, but everybody makes a sad end. Mary never feels safe again. That's why she travels to Europe. She feels like she can't even be safe in America. She begins to carry a gun with her, and Robert is worried that she'll do harm to somebody else. She is taking heavy narcotizing drugs because of her health problems, and so she's seeing things, she's saying strange things, she's carrying a gun. She starts to carry her money on her person. She becomes kind of like this financial bulimic. She's hyper-controlling of money. And so she's just potentially embarrassing or maybe going to harm someone or herself. And so Robert steps in and has her committed. Ultimately, it's the elder sister. The doctor asks Mary, "Is there anyone else who can take care of you?" And she says, "Well, my older sister has always been like a mother to me. There would be nothing more natural." And so Elizabeth writes to Robert and says, "Look, I'll take care of her." And that's in fact where Mary Todd Lincoln dies. She carries all of her swag up to Elizabeth's house, and the ceiling is apparently about to cave in, and they're just sure that they're going to all die. And then she just sort of turns ever tighter circles, her cataracts get worse, and she passes away in 1884. Any other questions?
What degree of comfort did Emily have in the South when she returned? Was she respected, looked up to?
That is a great question and an interesting one. First of all, she becomes a mother to what's called the Orphan Brigade. So Benjamin Hardin-Helm's brigade is known as the Orphan Brigade because they can't go home, essentially, because they're Confederates who can't return to Union-occupied Kentucky. So she becomes mother to the Orphan Brigade, very active in the UDC. So she is, yes, very much respected in the South. But it's her daughter who writes the first biography of Mary Todd Lincoln. And what they're trying to do is use their family to sort of heal the divide within the nation. Any other? Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all again very much for coming. Dr. Barrett will be here to answer questions if you have more questions for him. Otherwise, thank you all and good night.